Hello students, as promised I want to give you just a little quick voiceover on these prosody notes. This is something that I usually spend more time on, but we got sort of delayed by a few different things this semester, so we're going to do it in this form now. So let's start at the top of the page. There are three types of poetry, and I think we talked about this in class: lyric, dramatic, and epic. Most of what we read in our class was lyric poetry. But if you recall, one of the things that we talked about, particularly with the stanzas, was that tension between the lyric and the narrative. So there was a sense that a poem might do some of the things that lyric poems do in terms of the expression of an individual consciousness, but then there might also be sort of like a suppressed narrative kind of hidden in a poem that looks otherwise kind of empty. If you want a handy way to think about it, it's kind of a rhetorical distinction between or among lyric, dramatic, and epic poetry. Lyric, the sense is someone speaking directly to you. Dramatic poetry, the sense is that someone is putting on these different voices and presenting them to you. And then an epic, the sense is of a person talking about sort of a third-person situation where the poet is talking, but it's clear that he's supposed to be sort of representing a whole bunch of other people that he's not putting on the mask of. You can see the second thing on the sheet here is the definition of prosody. That should probably have been first, but this is how I do things. So prosody is the study of meter and rhythm in language, or the study of metrical structure of verse. That's really all that it means. And so we're going to talk about two sort of really important things in the study of prosody. One is the different sources of stress, and the other is the different types of meter in poetry. When we think about measuring language, that's what we're talking about with the meter of poetry, we need to have some kind of unit that we're measuring it in, and the kind of unit that we're using here is stress. Stress marks different different syllables for us. So a stressed syllable might sound louder, it might sound longer, it might be higher in pitch, or we might say that there's just more energy put into its articulation. So like when you say a word like articulation, that tick sounds louder than the y that comes right afterwards, articulation. But there are different places that stress can come from. So the first is etymological stress. In English, English is a highly stressed language, and so sometimes the words themselves will tell us where the stresses need to fall. So photograph, we know to say photograph, right? That's the way the stresses need to fall. When we put a Y on the end of that word, suddenly it becomes photography. And this is something that you all know about already. So there are very few of you out there who would say to somebody, I'm really into photography, or I'd like to take your photograph. It just doesn't happen. So the first source of stress is called etymological. It comes from words. The second source is called syntactic because it comes from sentences. So most often in English, if we have a sentence like the following one, their eyes will blink, we end up accenting eyes and blink. We tend to accent things like nouns and verbs more than other things like articles and adjectives. So sentences can tell us where the stress falls. Call that syntactic. The third source of stress is rhetoric or emphatic stress. So this is a case where you might emphasize certain words to change the meaning of a sentence. And not all languages can do this. English has this ability. So when I say she is my friend, what I mean is she's not your friend. When I say she is my friend, I'm responding to somebody who just said she's not my friend. If I say she is my friend, I'm telling you that it's not some other person. Or if I say she is my friend, I'm telling you that that person's my friend and not anything else. So rhetorical or emphatic stresses can change meanings in sentences in English. The source of stress that you'll probably find used least often, but is really important when it is used, is the literary source of stress. So sometimes we just go ahead and follow the pattern of stresses suggested by the poem at a given point. So in this case, if you were to read this sentence in if it was written in prose, or if you were just talking to a friend and you said, and by the incantation of this verse, that's probably how you would say it, and by the incantation of this verse. Neither of or this would really receive much stress. Now I'm going to mark this the way that the poem would ask us to say it. Okay, so you'll see that I'm indicating the stronger more stressed syllables by bolding them, like the by and the in and the te here. And I'm also dividing this line into its feet. So these are iambic pentameter feet. I know that from the rest of the poem that I'm not sharing with you right now. But we have 2 syllables per foot. And by the incantation of this verse. So this is sort of how we would split it up. Now, the next thing to think about is what happens to this foot right here. When we say, and by the incantation of this verse, we need to accent one of these two, and the one that we're going to choose to accent, according to the literary source of stress, is going to be this of. So let's go ahead and bold that. The way I would choose to read this line of poetry is, and by the incantation of this verse. And by the incantation of this verse. Of is the word that's getting promoted here by this literary source of stress. I wouldn't make this choice every single time, and it is a choice. And I think this sometimes drives students a little crazy about prosody. The whole point of prosody is to figure out the best way to read a poem out loud. I think for this poem, that's the proper way to do it. So 4 sources of stress. The stress can come from words, it can come from sentences, it can come from the rhetoric, or it can come from the literary meter of the poem. Let's talk about types of meter in poetry. There are all different kinds of languages in the world, and many of them have different kinds of meter that work for them. So there are some languages that use quantitative meter. That's based on the duration of syllables, long and short. We don't see this often in English because length is not a systematic feature of our language, but there are some languages where the length of a syllable actually determines its meaning, and so they're much more likely to use quantitative verse. So that's one we don't see often in English. We also have accentual verse. This is where you count only stressed syllable in each line. And so the lines can be of various lengths, but they'll all have the same number of stresses. And we can do this in English because we do have stressed and unstressed syllables. So one poet that we read who does this is Gerard Manley Hopkins. There are other people who also write in accentual verse, but especially in the last 500 years, it is not the most common thing to find in English. The third one is syllabic. So there are some types of poetry that work by just counting the number of syllables per line without regard for stress. So in French, there's a line called the Alexandrine that always has the same number of syllables, and they don't care about stresses because stress isn't a huge part of their language the way it is for ours. The fourth, this is the type of meter that we've seen most in the last 500 years of English poetry. We call it accentual syllabic, or foot verse, if you like. So this kind of combines the accentual and the syllabic, as the name indicates. It relies on the alternation of stronger and weaker stresses and the maintenance of a regular syllable count. So all the lines will have the same number of syllables, and they'll tend to have this pattern of strong and weak stresses within them. So if you hear about something being iambic pentameter, that means there are going to be 5 of these feet that we call iambs per line, with not that many substitutions. So the most common type of verse in English for the past 500 years has been accentual syllabic, and the most common type of foot that has been used is the iamb. That's the one we find most often. So really, we have feet of 2 syllables and feet of 3 syllables, and this is how some people say you can divide up all the possibilities in the world. So if you run into, if somebody says, hey, the feet in this poem are iambs, what they mean is that we're going to have a consistent pattern of less stressed followed by more stressed. So words like behold or awake follow an iambic pentameter. An iambic pattern. On the other hand, words like happy and clever follow the pattern that we call the trochee, where the accent comes in the first syllable instead of the second. It's also possible to have kind of equally stressed syllables land next to each other. We don't usually do it, but there are some times, like if you talk about the place called Key West, or if you say someone had a breakdown, those tend to be equally stressed. So we get either a spondee, both unstressed, or a pyrrhus, both stressed. There are also 3-syllable feet, like the anapest, that you hear in a word like understand, or in a phrase like "get a life." And then there can be the dactyl, like merrily and prominent, where the accent falls at the beginning. These are all feet that have been used and feet that you can find in English poetry. But the one that you're going to find most often in English is the I am. So that's kind of it for the little bit of prosody work that I wanted to give to you all. And if you have any questions about this, send me an email and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as I can.